and we are live for another edition of the All Gas No Break Sports Show. I am one of your co-hosts, Nicholas Pavone, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Andrew Johnson. Well, Johnson, we started with 12, went down to 8, and now we are down to the final 4 teams in this year's college football playoff. And what a wild ride it has been to get here. We've unfortunately had a couple of blowout games in this college football playoff. We had a thrilling quarterfinal matchup that we saw on Wednesday. We had a game moved to Thursday, and we saw a big win for a certain team in South Bend as now we head into the semifinals of the college football playoff. I mentioned down to our final 4 teams, and for some people, maybe not the 4 teams that we expected to get here, but these are the 4 teams nonetheless, as they all vie for a national championship.
And do I dare spoil the if you listen to this,
Oh,
you've probably watched it.
I already spoiled one game, so.
Down goes 1 through 4.
Yeah, down goes 1 through 4. People were probably expecting maybe the 3 and 4 seeds to lose, but
no one expected 1 and 2 to lose.
Maybe not 1
Absolutely
and 2.
nobody.
Maybe a little bit of 2 because of the injury to quarterback. That was a 50-50
He wasn't
game.
the problem though. Gunnar Stockton played a great game, and we'll go into that.
It wasn't really his fault. It was more of the fact that as that game went along, you could just tell that Georgia was kind of just screwed. It was more of the 1 seed and what happened to them. I think that's where everyone was stunned by, because that game was just over by the first quarter. But we'll break that game in just a little bit down. As I mentioned, we're down to our final 4 teams, and to get to that spot, Johnson, for these final 4 teams, we have to break down what happened in the quarterfinals of this year's college football playoff. And let's start off with the first game that happened on New Year's Eve between Penn State and Boise State, the 6-3 matchup in the CFP. And Penn State's run defense has been solid all season long, facing their biggest test in this game at Ashton Jeanty, who unfortunately in this game had a little bit of some miscues, had a couple of fumbles in this game. And, Penn State really was not able to take full advantage of the mistakes that Boise State was doing in this game. They had a 17-7 lead at halftime, but it felt like Penn State should have been up maybe more than the 10 points that they were up at half. Boise State even made this a 1-possession game in the third quarter going into the fourth quarter. So Boise State had some life going into the fourth, but their offense really just was not able to capitalize in that fourth quarter. They gave up another touchdown in the fourth quarter. They fall in this game 31-14, so their magical season comes to an end. The Nittany Lions of Penn State, Johnson, despite losing to Ohio State, they lost the Big Ten championship to Oregon. They are now one of the final 4 teams in the college football playoff, and they're 1 game away from playing for the national championship.
Yeah, this was a close game. This was 17-14, halfway through the third quarter. So this was a decent game. It's just that towards the end of the game, they couldn't do anything. And like you said, multiple turnovers for the Boise State offense. Maddox Matson throwing multiple picks. Jeanty, like you mentioned, struggled running the ball. Also had multiple fumbles. Just wasn't their day. I think if this was played maybe on a different day, maybe they do win this game, but you really hate to see it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were pulling for them in this game because, obviously if you're a Penn State fan, you weren't pulling for them. But, I think based off of, what Boise has done in prior years when you had guys like Kellen Moore on your team and stuff like that, they thought that maybe, just maybe, Boise could pull this one off, get the win, and pull off maybe the stunner of the entire season if they won this game. And they just weren't able to really capitalize on Penn State not capitalizing on their mistakes. Boise had plenty of chances to tie this game up. They just weren't able to do it. Penn State was able to capitalize on the Boise mistakes, and that's where really the difference was of this game. And it leads Penn State now to the semifinal of the college football playoff, and we'll break down just a little bit who they will be playing in the college football playoff semifinal. Now, Johnson, without a shadow of a doubt, this next game was the best game we've seen so far in this entire college football playoff, and that was the matchup with the 5-4 seed Texas versus Arizona State. Early on, it looked like that was not going to be the case. Texas was dominating this entire game in the first half. They scored 14 points in the first quarter, and that basically came off of just 3 plays of offense. One of them was a punt return. They then had a 2-play touchdown drive to get them up 14-3, and they went into halftime with a 17-3 lead. So it looked like Texas was going to roll with this game. Arizona State did make it a little bit interesting in the second half. They had a safety and a field goal in the third quarter, putting them within 17-8 going into the fourth quarter. And the fourth quarter was where all the magic went for Arizona State in this game. Cam Scatterboo, what can you say more about what he did in this game for the Sun Devils? Crucial 4th and 2, does a wildcat play basically. It seemed like he throws a touchdown pass. The running back throws a 42-yarder on 4th down to keep the game going. They get within 8 after getting the 2-point conversion, so they make it 24 to or they make it 24-16 after Texas scored a touchdown earlier in the fourth quarter. They then would get another touchdown later in the game after Quinn Ewers threw an interception. They drive down the field. Scatterboo scores a touchdown, gets the 2-point conversion later on as well. And Arizona State miraculously ties this game going into overtime at 24. Arizona State starts the overtime period, or both of these teams, I should say, started the overtime period, where Arizona State gets the touchdown. It looks like they are going to pull this one off, Johnson, up 31-24. Texas had a 4th and 13, if I'm not mistaken. And Quinn Ewers just throws his best pass of the entire day to Matthew Golden. Just an unfortunately inexcusable touchdown allowed by the Sun Devils. Ties the game at 31. Texas on the second overtime would score a touchdown in just one play and get the 2-point conversion as well to put them up 8. Arizona State would have one chance to tie the game. Unfortunately, they were not able to do so as they get an interception is thrown for Arizona State, and they lose this game 39-31. A heartbreaking loss for the Sun Devils as they almost pull off the miraculous comeback against the Longhorns. Texas just sneaks by and wins this game, and they will now go to the semifinals of the college football playoff.
Yeah, you kind of summed it up perfectly. There's not really too much to add right here. But one thing you didn't mention was about Cam. Even despite losing, Cam he won the player of the game here.
He
Which
deserved it.
yeah, 150 yards on the ground, multiple touchdowns, almost 100 receiving yards. It's just an absolute masterclass. He even had passing touchdown. This guy was the entire offense of his team because Sam Leavitt really didn't do a great job throwing the football here and making the offense turn. But Cam, man, any franchise, heck, I guess you can call them franchises nowadays because everyone's getting paid. Any college team would be lucky to have him.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think he's going to be a very hot commodity maybe now in the NFL draft with this game and how the rest of the season went for
Do you
him.
think he gets drafted? I'm sorry. Do you think he declares for the draft?
Probably. I think he might already be a senior if I'm not
Well,
mistaken.
it, news just came out today
He's a senior,
that
so
the NCAA is thinking about giving a fifth year of eligibility. So a lot can change.
a lot could change. But I believe he's going to be in the draft regardless. This is a very stacked running back class coming for the NFL draft. So any team would be very lucky to have him. He could be like that second day guy in the NFL draft that could be a spark for any team in the next 4 or 5 years potentially if everything works out. So you never know. But he single handedly kept them in this game with what he did. That big 42-yard passing touchdown, as I mentioned, had also 143 yards rushing as well as 99 yards receiving. He did it all for Arizona State in this game and kept them within striking distance considering the fact that they were down at one point in that fourth quarter by
Cam is
16
projected
points.
to go 82 right now, according to Tankathon. So let's see how that changes in the next 2 months.
Yeah, I mean, remember you got the Senior Bowl coming up as well as the NFL draft combine as well as his pro day. So he could very much well keep going up in the mock drafts or wherever if everything goes right for him. So hopefully that is the case because he's a very good young running back that could be very essential to any NFL team if he were to get drafted, and especially high, I should say. The last game on Wednesday that we saw was the game that we mentioned earlier, Johnson. The game that I don't think anyone really expected to go the way it went. Ohio State steamrolls past Oregon in the rematch that they had earlier in the season. They beat them by the final of 41-21. And the story of this game, it's pretty much simple. It's just two words: Jeremiah Smith. Smith had an unbelievable game for the Buckeyes. 7 catches, 187 yards receiving, 2 touchdowns in this game. Will Howard pretty much silenced all the doubters that he had after having a rough game against Michigan, had a very solid showing against Tennessee. He throws for 319 yards and 3 touchdowns. Ohio State, as I mentioned, it looked like early on in the first quarter this game was over. It was 14-0 Buckeyes going into the second. They go into halftime up 34-8. And Oregon just, at one point, maybe it looked like Oregon was going to come back. They got it to within, I think, 19 points. That was probably, I think, the closest they ever got it to. But they just had no answer in this game. Dylan Gabriel was under duress the entire time. Really couldn't make any good throws. They didn't even have one of their top receivers in Stewart. And it leads the Ducks to going from Big Ten champions in their first season in the Big Ten to now being one and done in the college football playoff as Ohio State advances to the semifinal, and they will take on the Texas Longhorns for a trip to the national championship game on the line.
Yeah, not much to say about this game, but Oregon got completely blown out. Ohio State looks like, I don't want to say they shook off the demons because this is only a quarterfinal game, and we have this whole conversation, or a couple of us had this conversation, that Ryan Day only chokes at Michigan. No, Ryan Day chokes in the big game. And are you going to consider this to be the big game right now?
This game or the next game?
This game. This is not the big game. I would say that game is bigger than college football quarterfinals right now.
Well, here's the problem, because the big game for Ryan Day has always been the Michigan game the last couple of years because they haven't gotten.
See, that's not necessarily true though, because he lost to Georgia in the playoffs, he lost to Mizzou, he lost to Oregon, he lost to Alabama, he lost to Clemson. So he loses in the big game, not only to Michigan multiple times, but to all these other teams in the semifinals, in the national championship game, because he can't close it. He can't.
Well, he hasn't been to a national championship.
Well, exactly.
But remember, the Missouri game, they had no one playing in that game. They were all declared for the draft, so they were never going to win that game regardless. The Georgia game, they had the game won, and if not for a last-second missed field goal.
Sucks. Yeah. Listen, if the Yankees had scored more runs during the World Series, they'd be the World Series champions too. But that's not how we.
You didn't have to bring that up.
I mean, let's listen. It's horseshoe and hand grenades.
You didn't have to bring that up. That was a shot at me.
It's not a shot. It's just saying.
A shot.
If the Knicks had scored more points on the Pacers series, they would have made it to the next round too.
What are we doing, man?
I'm just saying. Listen, you can't really just have excuses.
No, what I'm saying is that Ryan Day. I'm not saying only chokes in the Michigan game. It's mostly the Michigan game. But I can't really, I'm not going to count the Missouri. I'm not counting the bowl game against Missouri. That it's a game in which prior to that, if they won against Michigan, they'd be in the college football playoff. But then they lost that game, so then they got relegated to that game against Missouri. This playoff is perfect for them because they lose the game against Michigan. If it was a 14 playoff, they're out of it.
Now they lose to Texas?
They have no chance. Now against Texas, that's where it's going to come down to because, Texas, they lose the SEC championship game. They very much should have, a lot of people believe, should have lost to Arizona State after a missed targeting call in that game. So there was these two teams have had bad track records the last, whatever it is, 10 plus years. Ohio State, I think their last national championship was 2014.
Yeah.
So
been a decade.
It's a little bit over a decade, and they haven't really been close since. The closest they were was that loss against Georgia. I think what it really comes down to is for those two teams is which one is going to get over the hump. Now, the next matchup is more of two teams that have been, a lot of people will if you talk about teams that have been choke artists the last decade or two, it's the two teams that will break down the second matchup next. But that's where, these two as well, it's like Ohio State and Texas, something's got to give in that game. I think the weird thing for Ohio State fans is remember this also. After the Michigan game, they wanted Ryan Day fired. Now they're in a spot where they're 2 wins away from a national championship. So it's like, where where is your mindset on Ryan Day in this team now? Like, do you still believe in him? Are you going to look past the Michigan game now because of what's going on so far in the college football playoff? Maybe, but it's been a wild ride, and they're now, as I mentioned, 2 wins away from a championship.
No, this screams to me right now.
What is it?
Ryan Day right now is what Paul Christ was at Wisconsin. That's what it is right now.
Paul Chris wishes he could have gotten to this point in the season.
Well, early Paul Christ. You don't think Paul Christ on the VIS system would have Wisconsin in the
I mean,
playoffs?
Wisconsin definitely could have been. It could definitely be
They
a
always would
12
have
team
been the
playoff.
playoffs with
Yeah,
that with
yeah, they
this
would
because
definitely
they
be
were
in.
always they had 13 win seasons, they had 10, 11 win seasons. They were always in that top 10, but could
But
never really seal the deal. He was
if
another guy like that.
if you remember, they were in the dreaded BCS era where it came down to rankings and BCS metrics to get you into the top two. So that was never a fun time to try to figure out who was going to be the teams playing for the national championship because there were a bunch of teams that got screwed because of the BCS metrics. So he would have loved to play in this era where we had 12 teams playing for a championship. But that's how it is.
But hey,
And
they fired him, and now they enjoy back to back 7-win seasons with bowl losses. So good for them.
yeah, let's go to the final game that we had. That was the Sugar Bowl that happened on Thursday, yesterday, as of this recording. Notre Dame and Georgia taking place. And as we knew going into the game, Carson Beck was not going to play this game for Georgia. Got injured in the SEC championship game. So it was Gunnar Stockton who finished the second half of that game against Texas, getting the start for Georgia. And as you mentioned earlier on, he did not play a bad game whatsoever. I mean, he did as much as he could for Georgia in this game. The Bulldogs just could not run the football as they have been known for a while. And there are a bunch of key drops, which has been an Achilles for Georgia all season. They have the most drops in the entire nation in terms of wide receivers. That really plagued them in this game. There was a very controversial tripping play that happened as well for Georgia that really kind of, set the tone for what was going to happen for Notre Dame in this one entirely. Their defense shined in this one. Riley Leonard did just about as much as you could. Didn't have 100 yards passing, but was able to get 80 yards on the ground. His legs and ability to keep the play going were really what Notre Dame needed in this game. The Irish win this one 23-10 over Georgia, and they now advance to the college football playoff semifinal. As I mentioned earlier on, they will take on Penn State, who in a matchup where a lot of people in the last decade or two have been, look at these two teams and say to yourself, oh, if I
It's
had to
the
look up
choke
a
bowl.
team, exactly, if I had to look up a team that has never been able to get over the hump and has just had really excruciating losses throughout these entire last 2 decades, it's these two teams right here. And now those two teams will play for a trip to the national championship game.
And I think that's going to bring us into a mushing out because I have nothing to say about Georgia. They beat themselves with those drop passes. That's all I
Yeah,
have to say.
yeah, it's just a rough way to go for Georgia because you know the thing that sucked for them is not like I think in my opinion either Carson Beck played that game. I don't think Georgia still wins. I think the same result. I
No,
don't know if
because Gunnar Stockton played fine.
I don't. It nothing would have changed the factor of how this game went for Georgia. Their offense couldn't really capitalize on early mistakes by Notre Dame, and Notre Dame's defense just did phenomenal. If Georgia has a better running game, then that helps Georgia, and I think maybe it gets closer. But they could never run. They couldn't run the football at all in this one. They tried a bunch of different packages, and Notre Dame just dominated them in pretty much every aspect of it. So they're able to advance, and now they take on Penn State. And let's break down that matchup, Johnson, between Penn State and Notre Dame. The first matchup of the college football playoff semifinal. It is the 7th-seeded Notre Dame Fighting Irish and the 6th-seeded Penn State Nittany Lions. This game will be the Orange Bowl, played in Miami, Florida. Notre Dame goes into this game as a 1.5-point favorite. The over/under at 46.5. Who do you have winning this game, Johnson? As you mentioned it, the quote unquote choke bowl potentially for some people, with a trip to the national championship game on the line.
Penn State plus 1.5. I don't trust Notre Dame. I'm going to trust James Franklin more, ironically.
I'll go Notre Dame minus 1.5, and I hate it. But I think when I look at these two teams, if I gotta trust one of these two quarterbacks to win me the game, I hate to say it. I think Riley Leonard. I might be more confident in Riley Leonard. I think it also comes down to, you know, the biggest matchup for this game is going to be, because we just saw what Notre Dame did against Georgia's running backs. Can Penn State duplicate what they did in their last game against this Notre Dame defense? If they are able to at least have some sort of a running game, Penn State should win this game and move on to the championship game. In my opinion, though, I just think Notre Dame's defense is a little bit better than Penn State's. These are two of the better defenses in the entire nation. I'm going to go with Notre Dame to win this game and advance to the national championship game against either one of these two teams, Johnson, in our next matchup.
And that is number 6 Ohio State taking on number 3 Texas Longhorns. Texas plus 6. I mean, the spread is OSU -6 and the over under is 53.5,
That's
but Texas
insane.
plus 6. I can't see them laying 6 points in Texas. That's
It
crazy.
has to be because of what Ohio State just did to Oregon.
It is. It's 100% reactionary, and I don't believe in it.
And because Texas has been sneaking by in this playoff so far. You know, they didn't look dominant against Clemson. They were dominant for 3 quarters against Arizona State, and then the fourth quarter happened. Shoot. I'm just going to go with the over. I'm scared because I could see Ohio State maybe win this game by a touchdown. But if I had to pick between the spread, I would go with Texas plus 6 as well. I think the safest bet for me is just go with the over. These are two of the more explosive offenses in the entire nation. We've seen what Ohio State's done so far in this playoff, and we know Texas has the capability of scoring a lot of points, but can they do that against Ohio State defense that has looked very, very good so far in their 2 games? And they've done it against 2 very good opponents in Tennessee and in Oregon. So another tough test for that defense. Will they step up? I'm not so sure because there's a lot more wide receiver depth on Texas compared to the other 2 teams, in my opinion. So I'll just go with the over in this game. I think the national championship game for me is going to be Notre Dame versus. I'm gonna go with Ohio State. I think it's gonna be Notre Dame and Ohio State in the championship game.
And I'm going to take the inverse of Texas versus Penn State. So,
Who do you have winning?
Texas.
You have Texas. I have Ohio State winning.
I think I got to stick with Texas. That was my pick from the beginning of the CFP. So, sticking with Texas.
Yeah, I mushed Oregon. So, Ohio State, you're next. So, I'll take Ohio State to win the national championship against Notre Dame. But yeah, that's going to do it for the Mushing Hour. We have one more Mushing Hour left this season, Johnson. We'll break down the semifinals of the college football playoff. These games, will take place on Thursday and Friday of next week. So, tune in the following Monday or Tuesday, whenever we decide to record the next episode of the show, and we'll break down the 2 matches of these 2 games, and then we will give our final mushing hour of the college football playoff and the college football season with the national championship game, which will take place on January 20th in Atlanta, Georgia. It's going to be either Notre Dame and Penn State versus Ohio State or Texas for this year's national championship game. So we'll see which one of these final 4 teams will become one of the final 2 teams to try to winning a national championship this season. Any final thoughts, Johnson, before we wrap this one up?
I'm just looking forward to more great football.
Indeed as well. I'm looking forward to seeing how this one all unfolds. That is going to do it for this week's edition of the All Gas No Break Sports Show. We started with 12, we're down to 8, then got down to now the final 4 of this year's college football playoff. We have Notre Dame versus Penn State and Ohio State versus Texas in this year's final 4 of the college football playoff. Who will be the final 2 teams playing for the national championship, and who will come in on top as winning the first ever 12-team college football playoff, all culminating in a national championship. This has been Nicholas Papona, joined alongside by my co-host Andrew Johnson for the All Gas No Break Sports Show. Have a great rest of your week.